introduce the author of that book, Dr. Cathy Lassiter. Many of you know Cathy as not only a leading writer and consultant, but also somebody who has walked the talk, having positions of district-wide accountability in Norfolk Public Schools at the time when Norfolk won the Broad Award for the best urban system in the United States. Dr. Brian McNulty is known widely for his fundamental work in school leadership that works that he co-authored with Robert Marzano and Tim Waters, as well as Brian's extraordinary amount of prolific speaking and writing on the issues of leadership. Every time I listen to Brian and Cathy, I learn something new, and I know that you will too. So Cathy and Brian, welcome to today's webinar.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here too.
So I'm going to let Cathy start with these issues, and you take it away.
Okay, so from the March webinar, we had lots of interesting questions from participants, and we chose the ones that are on the screen now as sort of a representation of the many great questions that we got. And we categorized them under culture, and of course the data ones Brian will address in just a few minutes. But looking at creating a high-performance culture, principals and school leaders were interested in inspiring others, trying to deal with toxicity in their cultures, looking at transitioning to the Common Core. We heard the words buy-in quite a bit from resistant teachers in our questions, how to delegate leadership, looking at leading a leadership team, which is definitely the role of a school principal in creating a clear vision for quality instruction, and then knowing the importance of collaboration, how to facilitate full and open collaboration among a school staff. So those are the questions that we will address as a response to what our leaders in our last webinar said. Okay. So can we flip the slide? There we go. So what I'm going to talk with you about today is some of the research behind what creating a high-performance culture is all about. And in looking at some of the exciting new findings that are coming out from various fields, not just in education, but it's interesting that these are all merging together to say the same thing around high-performance cultures and what's involved. So what you see on the screen are the areas and fields of research that I've looked at for my book and putting them into a context of school culture and calling these the secrets. They're the secrets because it's research we don't normally look at in the world of education. So I think our participants will find this quite interesting. First and foremost from that research is the idea that humans, all human beings, are driven to seek purpose and conquer challenges. And we have the idea of conquering challenges, seeking purpose in your work. There has been tons of information written on human behavior, from Dan Pink to behavioral psychologists to biologists and so on, in reference to how principals, how leaders of any organization can provide the appropriate incentive, which does not include bonuses, gold stars, and ribbons, but definitely includes the incentive of conquering a challenge and working together for the greater good, for the sense of purpose and satisfaction of doing good for the community. Okay, as Doug works to get the slides up, I'll just
I'm catching up as fast as I can. There we go.
Okay. There we go. Okay, so now we're on to the next one. Okay, when we talk about creating an environment where people are eager to conquer a challenge and to work for a moral purpose, one of the things that we can do as school leaders is to engage our people in thinking about why we do the work we do and what we hope to achieve by doing it. When we ask ourselves these questions and we engage in conversations about why we do the work we do, we really get in deep to what people's, our teachers' personal motivation. We tap into the reasons why they became educators in the first place. We are able to create a common purpose for the entire organization because we're taking into consideration everyone's view on why we do the work we do and why that work is meaningful and has purpose for the greater good. I think a lot of times we as leaders and myself as a former principal sort of skip over the idea of a moral purpose in our work. However, that really is the glue that will bring a staff together around becoming a high-performance culture because they are connected emotionally to the vision and mission of the school. This is critically important because we're dealing with human beings. If we had a staff full of robots, it wouldn't make a difference. But since we have human beings who research has shown really desire to do good work and good work towards the greater good, then we have to engage in conversations about that and what that means for ourselves, for our students, and our community. Going along the same lines of that and providing incentives and getting to resistant teachers, the idea is not to use reward and punishments to motivate people. In fact, the research shows that rewards and punishments do not work in organizations that are organized around knowledge-based work. Teresa Amabile, who is a professor at Harvard, found that rewards and punishment can be effective for people who do highly routinized work. But for people who are involved in knowledge-based work, and that includes solving complex challenges, creating novel approaches to old problems, developing new creative strategies, carrots and sticks for motivation actually can demotivate people and have a detrimental effect. That we have, if we want an organization where everybody is on board with the same mission, it has to be through touching the intrinsic motives that bring them to the job. Okay? Along those same lines with the research around performance and finding solutions to our most vexing problems, we present the idea of positive deviance. And I would encourage leaders to not only discuss the reasons why we do the work we do, but to recognize that every organization has individuals who have found solutions to the problems that face us. And that many times the solution is right in front of us, only it's invisible to us for various reasons. So in that situation, we look for the positive deviants or outliers within our own community. And what that means is we're looking for teachers, specifically in a school, who have found solutions to the problems that others have not found solutions for. So these are your teachers who who no matter who is in their class from year to year to year, this teacher's students are always high performers. And that teacher is doing something that's very important that we need to investigate to try to determine what those vital behaviors are so that we can replicate them across the entire school. So far, creating a high-performance culture and looking internally for the solutions that we're looking for. One such school who engaged in vital behaviors and has become a 90-90-90 school is Fraser International School. It's in the Chicago public school system located in Southside Chicago. The staff in this particular school has implemented the practices of the 90-90-90 schools and have received tremendous results. Certainly the demographic makeup of the school is reflective of what you would find in Southside Chicago. We have very high minority population, over 90%. Close to 100% of the students are on free lunch. And on the most recent Illinois state assessment, this school scored a 93.3% proficiency in reading. And they rank at this time 21 out of 500 elementary schools in Chicago Public Schools. So on the slide you can see the red triangle represents where Fraser International School is in relation to the 500 other schools in Chicago Public Schools. This school is a positive deviant. This school has found solutions to struggles that others have not found the solution to. So to close this particular segment, many of you have probably read The Influencer, The Power to Change Anything by Patterson, which is an excellent book in reference to positive deviance and using, finding solutions from within to solve your problems. And this is his quote: "Discover a few vital behaviors, change those, and the problems, no matter what their size, will topple like a house of cards." And that's what we're looking for school leaders to do to create a high-performing culture within their schools.
So before we proceed, let's just check for a moment to see if we have questions from our colleagues. And I don't see any yet, but I want to invite all of you to participate by submitting questions anytime. And so, Brian, let's proceed.
I think Cathy's, don't you still have a couple of slides there, Cathy?
I do have a couple of slides. And so after we're finished with the secrets, with that interesting information from research on behavioral psychologists and the like, now let's turn our attention to collaboration. This was one of the questions that our participants asked about full collaboration in their schools and how to do that. So hot off the press is this particular research from professors at USC, Rutgers, and Columbia University, and they're suggesting that organizational leaders need a new set of skills when it comes to fully engaging our employees in productive collaborative work. That new skill set is displayed on the screen in the terms of 4 particular skills and areas of focus that we need to engage in to create a collaborative environment in our schools. So defining and building a shared purpose, cultivating an ethic of contribution, and that means a contribution for the good of the group, developing processes that enable people to work together. It's one thing to say we value collaboration and not have the structures in place that enable that work to take place. And then the infrastructure that is required in which collaboration is valued. What we talk about, what we value, and what we design our structure around is about maximizing collaboration among our teachers and our employees in an organization. So a new set of skills. I would encourage people to read that article, which is in Harvard Business Review. Also, around creating a collaborative environment is focusing on growing the talent that we have within our school settings. It may not seem like it today, but we are facing a severe teacher shortage in the next 5 to 7 years with the retirement of the baby boomers. And we are remiss if we don't address talent development in our schools and in our teachers, and that means the idea of deliberate practice. That means the idea of developing talent where teachers have potential, and determining that teachers have the skills that they need to transition to the Common Core, which was also one of the concern questions that was brought to us from the March 5th webinar. So Doug, if you can go on to the next slide, I just have 2 more, and then we'll get to Brian. 1 more. So Michael Fullen has a new book out, and certainly we're all very familiar with Fullen's work, and I love that he provided this information in the book, that the most attractive and best organizations are those that have a reputation for developing people. So again, when we're talking about developing a high-performing culture, we've got to take distributive leadership, shared leadership, talent development, and development of all people in strong consideration as we move forward to tackle the challenges that are ahead, given especially the fact that we'll have so many retirees coming up in the next few years. The development of our people in leadership, as far as instructional leadership and administration, is what will sustain our work and allow us to ready our organization for change as we move forward. Okay, so finally, my last one. Go ahead.
Come up. We said that carrots and sticks don't work. A lot of people, however, use positive behavior support with their students. That is quite clearly an incentive-based system. How do you reconcile the research on positive behavior support with the research on carrots and sticks?
Well, I would say that students come to school intrinsically motivated to learn anyway, and we have seen that in research from many, many researchers. However, the PBIS program is one that is research-based and is shown to work, but I would caution people to not base all of their work around incentives and punishments for student behavior. Certainly there's a structure behind PBIS that works, and I would encourage that, but when we're talking about staff, which is what creating a high-performance culture is around, we have to recognize, acknowledge, and work with the idea of intrinsic motivation. Everybody, students and adults alike, bring that to work with them, and we'd be foolish not to capitalize on the fact that it's there.
And how do you nurture fellow leaders who don't know what they don't know with an ethos of respect and collaboration?
Absolutely. There are, all of us are going to face school staff that don't know what they don't know. And so when you've got a culture where it's a culture of learning, a culture of progress, a culture of collaboration, and we're working with research that shows what the best practice is, and certainly that will come along. I wouldn't say that rewards and punishments would motivate a person to, or a teacher in particular, to want to learn something new. The best motivator for teachers, veteran and new, to learn techniques is feedback, deliberate practice, and evidence of progress, not the idea of punishments and rewards for progress, as some would have you believe.
Thanks.
Okay, and so to close out, in high-performance cultures, leaders are developed and supported at all levels, and this enables the organization to have the capacity to respond to change and sustain great work. So the final question that I would like to address from March 5th is that the idea of how do we help teachers transition to the Common Core. A culture of high performance is already ready for change. They prepare for change, and in many cases they embrace change. And when we have people working together for the greater good, and working to develop their skills at a constant level, learning at all levels, then they will be ready for the Common Core and any other challenge that might come their way.
Well, great. Thank you, Cathy. I'm assuming since this slide has penguins on it, that's nice to hear. So I'm going to talk about data, but I'm going to talk a little more broadly about data also, and directly link it to what Cathy was talking about, because if we can't create schools and school districts that are learning organizations, we are not going to make the progress we need to make. So, Doug, can we move on to the next slide? There's a list of issues that have surfaced in relation to using data, but particularly in relation to teaching and leadership decisions and actions. So the next slide, these are some of the questions that surfaced in the last webinar. And I'll try and touch on some of these, but let me just say right up front, because there are a couple of questions here. The second bullet, do you support certain data team protocols? And the answer would be yes. We talk about, the 5-step process as a part of our data team process that really has to be followed through, or now the 6 steps when we talk about monitoring. But really, that the 5-step process or 6-step process is a protocol. So we do support the use of a protocol. Matter of fact, we think the research is very, very clear about having to follow through on the protocol every time you meet. So I'm going to link that to the 4th bullet there, which is, are data teams different from grade level PLCs? The answer would be not necessarily, if they're using the protocol and following through. They're using data, they're making decisions around the data, they're collaboratively deciding on what the learning outcomes are, they're collaboratively deciding how to teach it, they go do it, and they assess it and come back. As long as they follow through on the protocol, then, PLCs and data teams are very similar. But again, you have to follow through on the protocol. So I'm going to touch on the rest of these questions as we go through the rest of the presentation. So the next slide here is a question, and those of you who have heard me before should know the answer to this, so hopefully this isn't going to be a big challenge to you. But let me just ask the question, first of all, what's the difference between highly effective and less effective teachers? So let me throw that out to you just for a minute. Let me give you just a minute to talk about that if you've got somebody there with you. And then I'll come back and address the rest of these. So let's just take 1 minute for you to have that discussion. Take about another 30 seconds. Okay, 10 seconds. back together. So those of you who've heard me before know the answer to this. The difference between highly effective teachers and less effective teachers is not what they know, it's what they do. It's their follow-through. So lots of teachers talk about knowing what sort of powerful instructional practices look like, but the difference between highly effective teachers is they actually put those practices into effect in their classrooms. Now, interestingly, we have found the same is true for principals, central office staff, and superintendents. Not what they know, but what they do and what they follow through on. So I'm going to try and follow that theme. And again, we'll get the slides back in order here. But the very first thing that I like to talk to people about is the most important thing for leaders is to focus. And I'm picking up on Doug's book here about leadership focus. But what we do know is that right now we don't implement very well in schools. So we've done a series of implementation audits all around the country, and people tell us that they're implementing things, and by and large they're not. So that this idea, and one of the reasons that they really don't follow through usually is they have too many things on their plate. So I've been talking a lot to principals and to central office staff about helping people focus on a few really important things. So Cathy talked about this when she talked about Patterson's book around really doing a few essential things very, very well. In Doug's book, he talked about, that we did a review of 2,000 schools in a double-blind review to find out what really mattered most in terms of making progress for all students. And the top single area was focus. People need to learn to focus. Why? Because they can't implement well. If they don't implement well, certainly they're not monitoring well. If they're not monitoring well, they can't provide feedback well, nor do they know what differentiated professional development to give staff to help them follow through. So unless we can help people focus first, we're not going to really make much progress. So when we start talking about data and talking about what to focus on, I'll talk about that in a minute. But, Doug talked in the book about focus was the first obligation of leaders. We really need to help people gain a focus first on what is important. And again, if you're going to ask me what's the most important work for people to focus on, I'm going to say the quality of instruction. So in looking at the quality of instruction, we're going to look at both instructional practices in the classroom, and we're going to look at the use of data teams and people following through on data teams. So that is the most important work that we can help people focus on. So how do we help people do this? How do we help people focus? So again, I've given you those two things to look at first, which is focus on instruction in two ways, learning new instructional practices, and number two then, the data teams. So the slide that was just up there was, okay, the first rule is don't collect any data that you don't act on. I go into schools and districts, and Doug said this at the beginning, that are drowning in data. We have too much data, and we have a ton of data that we don't act on. So people have understood the message about follow-through and understood even the message about collecting some monitoring data to give feedback to people about how well they're doing. But in reality, all of this walk-through data that people are collecting, I'm not seeing them act on it. So don't collect any data that you don't act on. And again, I understand the districts push a lot of data onto the building, but my recommendation to districts is focus what data you're asking people to collect, because we want them to act on the data. Again, remember, what's the difference between highly effective principals, central office staff, superintendents? Not what they know, but what they act on, what they do. So the second slide here, the second rule is be clear on why you're collecting and using data. So this goes back to Cathy's point, which is, if people don't understand why they're collecting the data, people are resentful of having to follow through to collect data that they don't seem to use. So the first purpose of data that I would recommend for people is that the purpose of the data is to provide feedback to students. So if students are doing their own assessment, or if teachers are using formative assessment, it's feedback to the teacher. Or if we are looking at monitoring and follow-through of adult practices, that is data that goes to the building leadership team. So, but people need to understand that the first purpose of data is feedback to the students, to the teachers, to the building leadership team, or to the central office or district leadership team. So that's the first reason why we collect data, is for feedback. The second reason we collect data is to create a culture of learning. So this goes right back to what Cathy was talking about before, which is we are trying to get people to learn how well are we doing. You know, we're doing a lot of work with John Hattie right now, and his big point is know thy impact. Know whether you're making a difference or not. So we are trying to help teachers and administrators understand whether they're making a difference or not. If it's not making a difference, do something else. Look for those positive deviants that Cathy was talking about. Who is making progress? What are they doing? What can we learn from them? So, interestingly enough, when we think about learning organizations, you know, I usually ask principals and central office staff, do you think that teachers and other support staff need to learn and evaluate new research-based instructional practices in an ongoing way? And almost uniformly, they will say, of course, yes. Teachers need to learn new practices in an ongoing way. Now, it's interesting to think about this, but if that is good for teachers, do you think it's important for principals to learn new leadership practices in an ongoing way? What about central office staff and superintendents? Do they need to learn new leadership practices? Do they need to be evaluating and looking based on their data at whether people are making progress or not? And clearly, the answer is yes. I don't think that we can ask teachers to follow through on new learning if we as leaders are not willing to follow through on our own learning. So this idea of us all learning from the data we're collecting and then all acting on the data we're collecting is the most important kind of data to collect, but again, only if we act on it. So the rule 3, which was that last slide, I'm sorry, Doug, for jumping around here a little bit, is know what data to collect. And we've talked about this a lot, certainly at the center. We've talked about cause data and effect data. Most people talk about the effect data. What's the evaluation data? What's it telling us, you know, in terms of progress of kids? But we really still are not as good at looking at the adult implementation data. You know, Cathy certainly could talk about this to a large degree, but in Norfolk, when they collected and reported the data back on follow-through on the part of teachers and on the part of administrators, just getting the feedback about how well are we following through made a difference and increased people's follow-through. So this idea of reporting data back to people is critically important also. The last slide that I'm going to talk about is trying to make connections here. So I want to talk about, and I put here, use your building leadership team and your district leadership team to analyze, interpret, and recommend and implement changes. Now that's a lot of stuff. The reason I tried to say this is people have to act on the data. One part of the data is feedback. Another part of the data is, are we going to follow through with different actions, or do people need some other supports? And this idea of differentiated professional development, meeting people where they are to help them, makes a difference. So data by itself doesn't cause people to change very much, honestly. Otherwise, we would all follow through on all of our good intentions, and we don't. So data is important for people to know where they are, but then to help people follow through, we have to, first of all, help people understand the whole idea of the change process. And that is linked to this idea of creating a sense of urgency of it's important for us to change now. And why is it important for us to change now? Because it's important for you and your kids. So this idea of how does it benefit me personally is really the only reason why people usually change. And I don't know for how many of you have ever read Everett Rogers' book on the diffusion of innovation, but you know, there's been a lot of work done here around how people really adopt new practices and follow through. And part of it is that they have to see that there's a personal benefit to them first. So this is why we want to show people, if people are following through with these practices, kids are doing better. If you follow through on these practices, your kids do better also. And that idea then of creating really quick wins for people so that they can see that kids are doing better is important for us also. So the follow-through in the data team process, the follow-through with specific instructional practices, these are at a granular level that you can follow through tomorrow and see what happens in terms of your own kids and their performance. This is not at a benchmark evaluation level. It's certainly not at a level of trying to follow through for the state, assessment. This is follow through on specific instructional practices that you can see then gains in your kids right away. So the last part then of that making connections for people is to create some degree of peer pressure with the data also. And that's, again, what the data team process does, is we look at people who are following through, how well did your kids do? Look at the connection between the way you taught it and the outcome that you got. So making this close connection then between the data and the practices and the outcomes that you're getting with your kids. So this fourth part here then is making connections both at the data team level, but also in your building leadership team, looking at the level of follow-through and looking at the outcomes you're getting, and then hopefully at the district level doing the same thing. We have been telling people to follow through on the same 5-step process at the building leadership team level. So we collect our data, we analyze the data, we look at the outcomes we're trying to get, we decide on follow-through on different practices to help people follow through, we evaluate that, and again, we go through the whole process, the whole 5-step process at the building level and at the district level. So the districts and buildings that we have following through on the data team process, not just with teachers, but at the building and district level, are the districts that are making most progress. Why? They are a learning organization. They're learning from their data. They're learning from follow-through on their own adult practices. So again, hopefully that wasn't too tangential, but I wanted to have people understand that this idea of using data in teacher teams applies to your building and also applies to the district level also. Okay, Doug, let me toss this back to you.
Brian, we have some questions that, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to pass along. First of all, you mentioned that some data are not acted upon. Could you give us examples of data that we don't act on?
Yeah, well, first of all, I go into a lot of buildings right now where they're collecting a lot of walkthrough data. So they have nice walkthrough data tools that allow them to collect sort of the frequency and use of practices, but honestly, they have so much data that they're not quite sure then what to do with it. So that's one example of that. We see it all the time when we get formative assessment data back from kids and we don't change our own teaching practices, so there's data that we don't use there. I see building leadership teams now struggling to define their roles and responsibilities to act on the data that they're collecting. So when I said we want to look at the follow-through with our data teams or with specific instructional practices, the building leadership team, then if they're seeing that certain data teams are not being effective, then that's data to them. And that they should be acting on that data by going in and helping to facilitate those teams to make progress. Or they should be looking at what additional professional development supports do we need to get the teams or individual teachers, but building leadership teams need to take action on their own monitoring data. So I'm seeing some reluctance to follow through on that on building leadership teams, and I think it's because it's a new role and responsibility for them. And then the last part of it that I would talk about is I see the same problem with district leadership teams not knowing what to do with the follow-through in the buildings. So they're really kind of, anxious about stepping in and taking the leadership role to act and follow through at the building level in their districts. And that would be, again, to either go out and do some joint monitoring with them, do some joint walkthroughs and observations with them. Matter of fact, I've been highly encouraging central office staff to go out and do walkthroughs with principals and just debrief the process. What did you see that you thought was really strong? What did you see that you think needed improvement, and why? But this is really a debrief then as a data piece for central office staff and principals. So I see data that's not being acted on all the time.
We've had quite a few questions on the data team process itself, which is a little more involved than we can do now, but I do want to let you know that there's both video and publication resources, including things like data team success stories and actual films of data teams in action. The real difference between what most people do and we're saying we need to do is the difference between looking at data and acting on data. Lots and lots of people have a PLC that diligently look at data, but when you ask them, can you give me one example of a different leadership or instructional decision you've made in the last 3 months based on the data, that's the conversation stopper. So we want to make sure that people aren't just looking at it, but for example, in April of every year, like right now, we ought to be saying what specific students are in danger of failure by the end of the year, and what specific interventions can we take this week to help avoid that kind of failure. That would be examples of going from data to action. And as Brian said, it's not just looking at the kids' data. From all the walkthrough data that we have, not every teacher action is equally valuable. We ought to be focusing on fewer and fewer actions, not more and more. And I'm seeing some of these telephone book evaluations that are not helping principals or leaders. Think, as Brian said, about focus. So we're on to our third leadership challenge. And this one is my turn about management of time. I just want to thank our participants for even raising this issue, because to be truthful, nobody wants to talk about management anymore. Everything's about leadership, and since Abraham Zalesnik in 1977 wrote the seminal article about leadership versus manager, nobody wants to be the hapless schlep who's, just the manager, who has a safe and secure environment, who organizes the school, who has an aligned curriculum and gets things done. They all want to be great visionary leaders. And I want to kind of be the spoilsport who says, you can't be a great visionary leader if you don't master the details of management. Because the #1 complaint that both administrators and teachers have is about time. So I'm just going to offer a couple of things that you raised and then a few quick responses. The questions that you raised previously are before you. And if you've read Richard Ingersoll's work about teacher dissatisfaction, you know that contrary to media reports, it's not bargaining rights and money that are at the top of the list. It is time. Principals similarly have time as a zero-sum game. They spend an enormous amount of time writing plans, engaged in compliance, doing things that they'll get in trouble for if they don't do, but the truth is every minute they spend on that is a minute that they're not spending on the instructional leadership issues that we need to engage in. So let's just address a few of these right now. #1, we need to don't bother having a meeting that doesn't have not just an agenda, but what I've called an exclusive agenda. And the reason I'm using that term is that I saw something called a professional learning community in a state not long ago, and they had 12, I'm not exaggerating, 12 different agendas. Why? Because the PLC time was all that they really had time for a meeting, but they had all these other things that they wanted to talk about. And so everything that involved human discussion wound up being crammed into the PLC, and as you can imagine, that's not a PLC. That's just a group of people meeting together in a very disoriented and disjointed way. An exclusive agenda doesn't just talk about what you're going to do, but it crowds out the things you're not going to do. And that's why we believe in the data teams process. If you didn't get to the action based on the data, then you didn't follow the agenda. pre-written minutes. What I think provides evidence that there is action related to data review is not the testimony or personal recollections of people, but rather that I can look at written evidence that in our previous meeting we committed to do this. In the intervening time, we did this, and here are the results. We committed to 3 different ideas. The first 2 worked. The third one didn't work so well. Here's how we're going to change it for next time. It's a clear written set of evidence from data to decisions. Now notice that it doesn't always work. Really good meetings don't just tolerate errors, they celebrate them. The scientist's maxim is you learn more from error than from uncertainty. So it needs to be okay to talk about, you know, I tried this intervention in math with my failing 7th graders and it didn't work. So before I beat my head against a wall, let's talk about why it didn't work and why they're not getting better, and either how I can modify this or how we can get better. Now that is a productive professional conversation. But I want to challenge my colleagues who are on the line here. Do you see people really reacting to the acknowledgement of error by saying, thank you for your integrity, what a thoughtful professional thing to say? Or does the messenger get shot for even talking about the fact that not every good idea actually works out? And finally, we must have a conscious not-to-do list. Whenever I've asked people to write not-to-do lists, most of them can't do it because they allege that everything they do is important. And those people have what I would call unconscious not-to-do lists. That means June is going to come. The sun will rise and set, and there will be a lot of things left undone. The question is, are the things that we fail to do as a result of a conscious choice? That is, we identified what we don't have time for, what's a lower priority, or are they result of a unconscious choice? Whatever you decided, whatever I decided, equally valid. Just in the last few days, I exchanged emails with people who were very, very reluctant to give up something out of their curriculum because they feared retribution from higher headquarters. We've got to cover everything. And even though they knew intellectually that coverage doesn't equal learning, that having deep proficiency at some things is more important than superficial exposure to others, making the explicit decision to give up a chapter, to give up a unit, to give up an activity is hard. But unless you're willing to do that, you're not going to be able to manage time as well as you need to. The final thing with regard to time is a brand new study just published a few weeks ago, April 2012, by the MIT Human Dynamics Lab. Now, I think considering the source, you'll see in a minute why this is really important. These looked at effective versus ineffective teams, and I think it applies to professional learning communities and collaborative data teams as much as anything else. First of all, these team members talk and listen in roughly equal measure. That is directly consistent with our filming of effective data teams, where the principal did not dominate the meeting, but rather the principal listened as much as he or she spoke and actually helped be the architect of an effective conversation. Members face one another, and the MIT authors mean this quite literally. They are looking at one another, making eye contact. You wouldn't think that you needed people from MIT to say that. Maybe that's because they were acutely aware of how little communication involves face-to-face contact these days. Members connected with one another, not just with a team member or with a team leader. They had back-channel conversations, meaning that the PLC is not an event, but something that happens all the time, every day. In the very first 90-90-90 studies, I was amazed at how informal conversations in the hallway were as important as the formal ones. The leaders are shapers and guiders of communication patterns to make sure that people aren't just sitting there glumly present, but are actively engaged as an effective team member. And perhaps the most interesting finding, what effective teams had in common was face-to-face contact. And what the least effective teams had in common was an over-reliance on email and texting. And so the next time you're tempted to email somebody who is literally 50 feet down the hall from you, I want to really encourage you to get up and talk to them face-to-face. Before you text somebody in the middle of a meeting, particularly if that person is sitting in the same meeting, instead, put them down and talk to them. I'm not anti-technology. I do think we need to consider that when you have the leading technological institution in the world saying sometimes you got to do things face-to-face for effective team management, that's worthwhile considering. I want to now invite your questions for Cathy, for Brian, and for myself. So let me take just a break, get the question function, and invite your participation. Brian, here's one for you. Can you give some specific examples of change that may occur when connecting the building level teams and the district level teams?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Here's what we're seeing is the kind of connections that we really want to see is what levels of support and what kinds of support are most effective for individuals, for teams, or for specific schools. So let me personalize this a little bit. At the building level, if the building leadership team is looking and what they're seeing is that certain of their data teams are making great progress, but a couple of their data teams are not making very good progress, the building leadership team members have stepped in and facilitated those team meetings. So literally they stepped in and were the facilitator for those teams till the teams were strong enough to get through the entire sort of 5-step process and the protocol and able to do it themselves. Now what I've said is every principal should be competent enough to do that, but in reality, lots of principals have to learn the process themselves. So we've seen that at the district leadership team level where they've said we have to provide more support and training to our principals to lead the data team process. So they've pulled principals back, done more training for their principals, specifically on leading the data team process. Because one of the findings from the research is unless the principals are leading the data team process, it doesn't take hold in the building. So principals need to be skilled enough to do this also. So over time then, what the district leadership team members have done is gone out and they have sat in with principals facilitating data team meetings also. So again, these are the kind of actions that we want district leadership teams and building leadership teams taking. It really is what's the level and kind of support that either individuals or the teams need to move the work forward. Rather than saying we're not making progress, it's the team's responsibility at the building and district level to say what actions could we take and how will we know if our actions were effective or not. So again, it's taking action, it's evaluating it. I don't expect the teams to hit it right on the nose 100% of the time, but if they're acting on the data that they're collecting and if they're evaluating them, people's follow through and their effectiveness, guess what? Those building leadership teams and those district leadership teams become more effective themselves. And in addition, they're modeling the same process that we're asking teacher teams to go through.
So we've got a couple of other questions. The first one is a recollection of something that I said at a previous conference, which is that we need to think about how athletic coaches give feedback. And that is precisely correct. An athletic coach that holds a stopwatch when somebody runs across the finish line, but then doesn't tell the runner how fast or slow the runner was, is like people who collect lots of data but never use it. Or they tell the runner how fast and slow they were, but they don't give the runner any specific advice on how to run better or faster, how to improve form. That's the difference between just looking at data and actually making improvements. I think the athletic coach analogy, at least as far as good coaches, is quite apt. Cathy, here's one for you. What advice do you offer for principals to coach their district level teams and staff who come to, quote, support, unquote, building level teams?
Well, that's a tough position to be in, and I certainly understand a principal's desire to know how to do that. I would first say that to set the model in the building of what appropriate support looks like would be the first start. But then to engage in some very candid conversations about what central office could do excuse me, to support the schools, that would be meaningful support. So as Brian was talking about the connection between the building level data teams and the district level teams, I think that's a very good start in having people to understand a process for data analysis and modeling that same process in both locations. But then I would also say outside of the data teams process to, again, engage in candid conversations with central office about the type of support that a school needs in order to move forward. Central office people definitely need a paradigm shift in the way that they support schools. A central office should be a school support center. And everything that happens in the central office should be designed to support schools and move schools toward their goals and raising student achievement. And, sometimes it starts just with a simple conversation around those lines.
I would ask everyone on this call who might be a central office administrator, perhaps a state or provincial administrator, maybe some from a Ministry of Education internationally, to ask this question the next time you're tempted to send an email or make a request of a principal. And here's the question. Is what I'm about to do going to let that principal spend more time as an instructional leader or less time as an instructional leader? Because part of what Cathy Lassiter's new book shows is that despite the best intentions to have principals spend more time as instructional leaders, the truth is the direct observations of principals reveal exactly the opposite. They spend less time because they're involved in compliance. Here's a question for both of you. Could you think of right now, what advice would you give to principals at this time of the year to ensure that they finish strong? Brian, do you want to take a crack first?
Yeah, again, the most important work that principals do is their instructional leadership work. Now, Ken Leafwood's new book that I would highly recommend to everybody says that there's really only two forms of instructional leadership that make a difference in terms of student achievement. One of those are direct feedback to teachers, going into classrooms, making observations, and giving feedback to teachers. Okay, so that's one. And the second then is, again, facilitating the data teams or their teacher teams. Those two actions by principals make the most difference in terms of student achievement. And staff see them as then actively involved in the instruction of kids within the school. So if you're going to ask me, I'm going to say those are the two most important things where you should be spending your time. Cathy, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I would add one thing to what Brian has said, and I will recommend a book just like he did, Vivian Robinson's book called Student-Centered Leadership. And it's basically, it's detailed information in reference to the findings that she made in 2008 on the study of principal actions, leadership actions that lead to improved student learning. So here's my number one recommendation. She found a 0.84 effect size for principals promoting and participating in teacher learning. To finish strong, I would say principals who have been participating and promoting teacher learning all along to continue and to not allow all of the end-of-year activities pull you from that task. And for principals who have not yet found the time to participate with teachers in their learning and promoting teachers' learning, to find time between now and the end of year to make a step in that direction. That this action is the one that will give you the most benefit and have the greatest impact on student learning to and through the teachers on the staff.
And this is Doug. I'll just close with a couple of my own best ideas. Here are some things that you could do that would improve the last 2 months of school right now. And that is, number one, if you've got a grading system that uses the average to calculate your final grades in May or June, get rid of it. Do not use the average. Manually override it. Do it, whatever you have to do, stop using the average. Because if you have students who feel that they are hopeless in April and May, they're going to be your worst discipline problems and will fail. If they feel that they can finish strong and work hard, you'll have the best April and May and June that you've ever had. Get rid of the average. Secondly, think about incentives to get work made up and submitted rather than punishments for things that students have already done. One of the best incentives I've seen at the secondary level or early final exams. At the elementary level, it's not too late for those big springtime projects that are make or break for some kids to get them done. And finally, if you're in a state with mandatory retention, and there are a growing number of them for your third graders, move heaven and earth to avoid that. If you have to triple the amount of time students spend on literacy to avoid a mandatory retention, then do everything you can to avoid that, because there is not one scintilla of evidence that says retention does anything except increase the dropout rate years hence. My legislative proposal is that anybody who votes for mandatory retention ought to therefore volunteer to chaperone the 7th grade dance that's going to have some 18-year-olds at it, because that's what they're going to create for us a few years down the road. Well, our time has expired. I want to give my deep thanks to my colleagues, Dr. Cathy Lassiter, Dr. Brian McNulty, and to all of you for joining us not only in the U.S. but around the world. Please continue to let us know what you'd like to hear on future webinars, and we'll do our best to meet your needs. Thanks, and have a great day, everybody.